From the moment that a patient makes their way into my office, I now have to start piecing information together to ultimately come up with a game plan of how we're going to help this person. So, broadly speaking, because there's a number of branches off these two general ideas, but broadly speaking, I want to try and figure out if this particular person is more of a rehab case, as in we'll be engaging in some sort of physical activity within the office, or is this a metabolic case in which we should probably analyze their labs and manage this case through dietary and lifestyle interventions. And oftentimes it may be both. It just all depends on the uniqueness and complexity of that case. And then, of course, there is the option of possibly referring out to another provider, but I try to do a pretty good job about that before the patient ever even makes it into my office because I do a free phone consultation with all inquiring parties before they ever even schedule. And so, if on the initial phone call it sounds like something that is outside of my wheelhouse, I will usually make a recommendation for another provider at that point. So, back to which route we want to dive down. The example that I often utilize with my patients is imagine that your house is on fire. What would be ideal for you is to put out that fire and then you can start the remodel and all, that follows. What would be less ideal is if you just started remodeling your house and putting in new furniture and what have you, all the while that fire is still ablazing. That's what I want you to think about when it comes to doing rehab versus nutritional and lifestyle changes. If you have some underlying metabolic issue going on, like let's pick something easy like anemia, I want to manage that issue first because if you're anemic, it will make sustaining any long term progress through rehab a little bit more difficult. So let's put out the fire first and then we can hop into doing rehab if necessary. Now, if we do have to embark upon the path of analyzing one's blood work, how do we actually analyze that data? If you've had your blood ran before and you've actually read the study, you should notice that off to the side, there's typically a little reference range for each individual marker. And the question I'd like for you to ponder upon is how are these ranges actually established? And how do I know that those reference ranges are what is acceptable and applicable for me? Sounds like a pretty fair question, right? So I want to read you an excerpt from a textbook called Diagnostic Hematology, which is considered to be the book for hematology, aka the study of blood or blood-related disorders. The author states that all laboratory testing procedures are really estimations, regardless of how carefully the tests are done and of the degree of sophistication of the equipment and the personnel. The user should be aware of inherent limits that the laboratory operates within, no matter how good or even certified or accredited it is, and should also know how clinical acceptability varies within different tests. The clinician cannot abdicate his responsibility in this regard and has therefore an obligation with regard to taking and submission of specimens and then deciding how to approach the results once received for his clinical purposes. It is well to re-emphasize the common preconception that only are laboratories' results wholly writ, but they are 100% reliable at all times is a fallacy. I think this is really important and what we should really emphasize that when you have a panel ran, it really is just a snapshot in time, which is why I often request from a patient not just their most recent panel, but also any panels that they've had done before, within the last few year time frame so that I can see how those numbers are trending. Let's use glucose and diabetes for an example. By definition, diabetes is diagnosed once your glucose levels have hit 126. But if I can look at your labs and see that over the years they have risen from, let's say, 85 to 92 to 112, we don't have to wait for it to hit 126. We can intervene now before things become much more difficult to manage. So how exactly are we deciphering what is and or is not normal? Well, this author states that the other logical problems have caused the word normal to be replaced with reference. These ranges are fairly arbitrarily defined in terms of the standard deviation or the coefficient of variation and mean that certain results near the limits are excluded, possibly unfairly, the idea being to exclude any subclinical abnormal results which in fact may not be present. So let's break this down. We'll use an example of a patient that I literally just saw this morning. This woman fainted while on the treadmill, and when she woke up and went to the ER, they drew blood on her and they told her that everything was normal. Now, a few weeks later, she had some more blood drawn at another facility per the recommendation of another doctor. And what I was able to point out to her was that even though these two separate panels had some of the exact same markers, the ranges weren't always the same. Why would that be? Well, ranges are created based upon the average of all the people that go into that particular lab. And hopefully you see how this can be a little bit problematic, because most of the folks that head into the lab are not there because they're so healthy that they want to see how they can gain a little competitive edge in life. Now, they're usually sick, right? So people that are struggling and trying to gain some answers as to what may be contributing to their current state of health. So now the range that you're basing your results upon is an average of a bunch of sick people. On top of all that, if you actually look at the reference range, they're usually really wide ranges, because when they take that average, they're only chopping off like the top and bottom 10 to 20%. And this is where someone like myself, who takes a more functional approach to healthcare, comes into play, because there are so many people out there who are told that their labs look normal, but they don't feel normal. Well, newsflash, if you don't feel normal, your labs are probably not normal. And I have to imagine that that statement alone must be so fulfilling for you or someone that is actually struggling with their health, because it has to be so debilitating bouncing around from one provider to the next just to be told, yep, everything looks fine. Luckily, I have never had to personally experience that for myself, but I do see it, I mean, at least weekly, if not daily, in my own office, and I feel for you folks who are stuck in that rat race. So, what does it mean to take a functional approach? Well, we've already established that your traditional healthcare provider is going to take whatever marker that they ran, look over at the reference range, and say, well, this number is between this range, so that looks fine. A functional approach requires a bit more work, because we're going to actually dive into the literature a little bit and see if there have been studies performed on this individual marker to see if there's any validation studies on appropriate ranges for whatever that marker may be. And then what I think is the most important, and something that we've already touched on a little bit, is being able to notice patterns or trends within one's blood work. So, for example, let's use anemia again because it's real easy and most people know what it is. In order to be diagnosed with anemia, you need to have three things low: either your red blood cells, your hemoglobin, or your hematocrit. Now, once one of these are low, we can diagnose you with anemia, but then we have to figure out what kind of anemia, because you could have an iron deficiency anemia, or a B12 anemia, aka pernicious anemia, or what they call anemia of chronic disease, and so on it goes. There's a number of different kinds, and that hopefully emphasizes the importance of running a comprehensive panel, because if you have more data, then we can come to a more appropriate diagnosis, which ultimately means a more effective treatment plan. One last story, and then we'll wrap this whole thing up. I had a patient who I wanted to run labs on, and at least at the time, I have since figured out this is not true, but at the time I thought that since I'm a cash pay clinic, that I couldn't order labs for a patient and have them use their insurance. They'd have to pay out of pocket. Like I said, I figured out that that's not the case, and we can actually bill someone's insurance. But anyway, I gave this patient a list of the markers that I wanted to run and said, take these to your primary care provider and have them run them. And since he is in your network with your insurance company, it should be covered. Well, that provider told my patient that he would not run all of the markers that I wanted ran. And when the patient asked him why, he stated that it was because if a marker came back abnormal and he did not know how to interpret that test, he would then be held liable. Now think about that. This doctor was not willing to run a test because if by chance something came back that he didn't know how to interpret, he would then be held liable. So basically, if he doesn't see it, then it must not be there. What blows my mind even more is that this doctor is a primary care provider. So that is literally his job. When things are outside of his wheelhouse of expertise, his job is to refer that patient to a better suited provider. Is that what you would consider patient-centered care or doctor-centered care? And also, last thing, I did end up having a conversation with that provider, which did not go very well. If we ever get a chance to meet in person, I'd love to tell you that story. But take into consideration next time that you're frustrated with the healthcare system, that, I mean, I would at least like to believe that these are all good people who want the best for you. but ultimately are handcuffed by the folks that are actually picking up the bill, aka the insurance companies. And it's, just not a great idea to bite the hand that feeds you.